At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobodura airfield in Guinea, watching his pilot prepare for a mission he probably wouldn't survive. The pilot was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, 6 combat missions, 0 kills. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to intercept the morning patrol. Hayes would be flying straight into them. McKenna had been maintaining P-38s for months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Twin-engine fighter, twin-boom design, fast in a straight line, a monster at high altitude. But the P-38 had one fatal problem that was killing American pilots every single day. It couldn't turn with a zero. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was lighter, more agile, and designed specifically for dogfighting. In a horizontal turning fight, the Zero could complete a full circle nearly twice as fast as the P-38. That difference meant death. Doctrine was very clear. P-38 pilots should never try to turn with a Zero, never attempt to outmaneuver them in a dogfight. Instead, they were trained to use speed and altitude, dive down from above, fire in a high-speed pass, then climb away before the enemy could respond. Hit and run, boom and zoom, never get caught turning. Hayes had tried that doctrine 5 times already. It hadn't worked. The Zero pilots were too experienced. They baited American pilots into turning fights. To retreat, then reverse direction instantly and cut inside the P-38's turning radius. Once a Zero got behind a P-38, the fight was usually over. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in the past 6 weeks. Most of those aircraft were shot down after being trapped in turning engagements they couldn't escape. McKenna had watched too many pilots die. Good men, young men, kids, really. They climbed into their aircraft confident they would come back. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. The training manuals blamed pilot error. Instructors insisted the problem was poor discipline. Pilots were not following doctrine, but McKenna knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots. The problem was the control cables. Inside the P-38's twin boom structure, a system of steel control cables connected the cockpit controls to the aircraft's control surfaces. When a pilot moved the control stick, those cables transmitted the movement through pulleys and guide points to the ailerons on the wings. The system worked well enough, but it had a flaw. Slack, not much, about 3/8 of an inch of full deflection. According to factory specifications, that slack was acceptable. It fell within normal engineering tolerances, but McKenna had spent months working on those cables. He could feel the difference with his hands. That tiny amount of slack caused a delay, a very small delay. When the pilot moved the control stick, the slack had to tighten before the control surface actually responded. At high speeds, the delay didn't matter. But in a slow-turning dogfight, that fraction of a second could mean everything. Because while the P-38's controls were taking that moment to tighten, the Zero was already turning, already moving, already getting into position for a shot. McKenna had mentioned the problem to the squadron's engineering officer 2 months earlier. The officer checked the maintenance logs, checked the cable tensions, everything was within factory tolerances. The officer said nothing wrong with it. Adjusting the cables outside those limits would violate maintenance regulations. Field mechanics were not authorized to modify flight control systems. Any changes required engineering approval from the aircraft manufacturer, and the manufacturer was Lockheed, 7,000 miles away in California. So McKenna did something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's maintenance manual. He modified the aircraft himself. The idea came from a piece of piano wire. 2 weeks earlier, a damaged P-38 had been stripped for spare parts after a ground accident. McKenna had salvaged a 6-inch section of high-tensile wire from the rudder trim system. He kept it in his tool bag without knowing why. Now he knew. Late that night on August 16th, after the maintenance crew had gone to sleep, McKenna returned to the hangar alone. The air was hot and heavy with tropical humidity. Insects buzzed around the overhead lights. He removed the inspection panel from Hayes' aircraft and exposed the aileron control cable inside the boom. Then he grabbed the cable and pulled. He could feel the slack immediately. 3/8 of an inch. Exactly what the specifications allowed. Exactly what was getting pilots killed. McKenna took the piece of piano wire and bent it into a Z shape using a pair of pliers. The wire fought back against the bends. It was strong. His hand slipped once and cut his thumb open. Blood ran down fingers, but he kept working. The Z shape would act as a tensioner. When installed between 2 cable attachment points, it would add a small amount of tension to the control system, just enough to eliminate the slack. Nothing dramatic, just a tiny adjustment. But tiny adjustments matter in combat. It took 8 minutes to build the tensioner. Installing it was harder. The space inside the aircraft boom was narrow and dark. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. He disconnected the cable at a pulley junction, dropped the clevis, and spent 5 minutes searching for it in the dock. All the while, his heart was pounding. Because if anyone caught him modifying a flight control system without authorization, he would face a court-martial, possibly prison, but Hayes would die if he didn't try. Finally, the tensioner was installed. The cable was reconnected. McKenna pulled on the control line and no slack. The control surface moved instantly. He closed the inspection panel, cleaned his tools, and walked out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he walked to the flight line and watched Hayes prepare for the mission, watched the ground crew fuel the aircraft, watched the armorers load ammunition, watched Hayes climb into the cockpit. At exactly 7:42 a.m., the P-38 Lightning roared down the runway and lifted into the sky. McKenna stood there watching until the aircraft disappeared into the clouds. He had no idea whether the modification would work, no idea whether the aircraft would even survive the flight, but he knew one thing for certain: Hayes now had a chance, and sometimes in war, a chance was everything. The problem wasn't that American pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it, every training flight drill it. Never turn with a zero. Use speed, use altitude, hit and raid. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that combat didn't follow doctrine. Lieutenant Rob Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months. 23 years old, a farm kid from Iowa. He'd flown 6 combat missions and had 0 kills. Not because he was a bad pilot, because he followed the rules. And the rules kept putting him in positions where he couldn't get a shot. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dove on a 0 from altitude, built speed to 400 miles per hour, and came in from the sun, just like the manual said. He got the 0 in his gun sight, started pulling ahead the 0. Suddenly, Snap rolled left and dove. Hayes rolled to follow. But his P-38 felt like it was moving through mud. By the time the aircraft pointed where he wanted, the 0 was gone. 4th mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman jumped 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes fired first, missed the 0, reversed hard right. Hayes rolled to follow. His wingman suddenly shouted on the radio, 2 more zeros diving from above. Hayes tried to roll back level and dive away. The airplane responded, but slowly. Just slowly enough that one of the diving zeros managed to fire a 3-second burst into Hayes' right boom. 20-millimeter cannon shells. They didn't penetrate the structure, but they scared Hayes badly enough that he broke off the fight and ran for home with his engines smoking. The 5th mission was the worst. Hayes watched his wingman die. The wingman's name was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old. From Austin, they had gone through flight training together. August 14th, Parker became separated from the formation during a dogfight over Finch Hyphen. 2 zeros got behind him. Parker tried everything: hard rolls, reversals, scissors. But the 0 stayed with him through every move. Hayes could hear Parker over the radio calling for help. The panic in his voice. Parker shouted that his airplane wasn't turning fast enough. Hayes pushed his throttles forward, trying to reach him, but he was too far away. He heard the gunfire, then Parker screamed, and then silence. Hayes didn't sleep that night, neither did most of the squadron. Parker's bed stayed empty. His personal belongings were packed into a wooden crate and sent home. His aircraft was written off as a combat loss. The maintenance log listed no mechanical problems. Official cause of loss: pilot error. McKenna had personally serviced Parker's aircraft that morning. Everything had been perfect. Engine timing correct, control surfaces aligned, cable tension exactly specifications. According to the book, the airplane had been flawless, but Parker was still dead, and McKenna knew why. That tiny fraction of a second delay in the controls, that small amount of slack in the cables. The manual said it was acceptable, but acceptable was getting pilots killed. And the worst part for McKenna was the routine. Every morning he walked onto the flight line before sunrise. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot oil, and metal. Generators hummed. Ground crews shouted across the tarmac. Pilots joked with each other before missions. Some of those pilots would return, some would not. McKenna had watched it happen again and again. 17 pilots in less than 2 months, all flying the same airplane. All dying the same way, caught in turns they couldn't escape. And every time the official reports blamed pilot error. Never the aircraft, never the design, just the men who died. On the evening of August 16th, Lieutenant Hayes came to the maintenance area. McKenna working beside his assigned P-38. Hayes looked exhausted, eyes red, uniform wrinkled. He asked McKenna a simple question: is there anything you can do to make the airplane roll faster? Anything at all. Hayes said he didn't care whether it was regulation or not. He just wanted a chance to survive. McKenna looked at him carefully. He saw the fear. But more than that, he saw determination. Hayes knew exactly what he was asking, and he knew the risk. McKenna finally said one thing: back in the morning, I'll see what I can do. That night, McKenna stayed in the hangar long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The building was quiet. Only the distant hum of generators and the buzz of insects around the lights. Humidity hung thick in the tropical air. He opened the inspection panel inside the left boom of Hayes' P-38. The metal was still warm from the daytime sun. Inside the boom, the aileron control cable ran through several pulleys toward the tail. McKenna grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled. There it was again, the slack, maybe 3/8 of an inch. Exactly within factory tough slack still lay. His fingers were black with grease. His arms ached from a full day of maintenance work, but he could feel the problem clearly. He had felt it for months, and he was tired of pretending it wasn't killing people. The piece of piano wire came from a wrecked P-38 that had ground looped on landing 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft had been written off, but McKenna had salvaged useful components before it went to the depot. One of them was a 6-inch piece of high-tension piano wire from the rudder trim system. He had kept it in his tool bag. Now he finally understood why. McKenna sat on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers. He bent it slowly into a Z shape. The wire fought back against the pliers. His hand slipped. The sharp edge cut into his thumb. Blood ran across his fingers. He wiped it on his coveralls. Kept working. It took 8 minutes to shape the wire properly. The Z shape would act as a tensioner. Just enough force to remove the slack in the cable, no more or no less. Installing it was harder. The interior of the boom was cramped. He had to work one-handed while holding a flashlight with the other. His shoulder pressed against the metal frame. Edges scraped his arm. Sweat ran down his back. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the small clevis pin. Slipped from his grip and disappeared into the darkness inside the boom. He swore quietly. Spent several minutes feeling around in the shadows until he found it. The entire time his heart pounded. If an engineering officer caught him making unauthorized modifications to a flight control system, he could be court-martialed, possibly imprisoned, but if he did nothing, another pilot would die tomorrow. Finally, he inserted the piano wire tensioner, reconnected the cable, forced the clevis pin into place. Then he tested the cable. He pulled hard, no slack. The control surface moved instantly. Exactly the way it should, exactly the way it always should have. McKenna replaced the inspection panel carefully, tightening every screw exactly the way it had been before. When he finished, there was no visible sign that anything inside the aircraft had changed, but everything had changed. He wiped the grease and blood from his hands, packed his tools, and stepped outside the hangar. Tropical night air was thick and warm. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft guns echoed faintly. Japanese night raiders were probably somewhere over the coastline again. McKenna looked up at the dark sky. Tomorrow morning, Lieutenant Hayes would fly that airplane. If the modification failed, Hayes would crash. If it worked, maybe Hayes would live. McKenna went to his bunk, but never slept. He stared at the ceiling until sunrise. At 6:30, the flight line came alive. Ground crews rolled fuel carts toward the aircraft. Armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the P-38's nose. Pilots walked out of the briefing room, helmets under their arms, joking with each other the way fighter pilots always did before combat. Hayes found McKenna beside the aircraft. He didn't ask what had been done. McKenna didn't explain. They simply looked at each other for a moment. Then McKenna nodded once. Hayes climbed into the cockpit. At 7:42, the twin engines roared to life. The P-38 light began to taxi down the rough strip of coral and dirt at Dobodura airfield. McKenna stood on the edge of the runway and watched the aircraft accelerate. The engines screamed. The airplane lifted into the humid morning air. 16 other P-38s formed up around Hayes' flight. Then they disappeared toward the northwest, toward Japanese airspace. After that, there was nothing McKenna could do but wait. The engagement at 8:14, Hayes' flight spotted the enemy. 9 Japanese fighters flying at around 13,000 feet, Mitsubishi A6M0s. They were moving in a loose defensive formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. Hayes' flight leader called it out over the radio. Bandits, 11 o'clock. The American pilots had altitude advantage. That meant one thing, a diving attack. The P-38 formation rolled over almost simultaneously. 16 American fighters diving toward the Japanese formation. Hayes picked a 0 near the back of the group. His aircraft accelerated rapidly. 100 miles per hour, 350, 380. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight. He could clearly see the red rising sun painted on the fuselage. For a moment, he even saw the enemy pilot's helmet through the canopy. Hayes pressed the trigger. The P-38's nose erupted in fire. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon hammered together. Tracers streamed forward through the sky. Most of the rounds missed, but several struck the 0's wing. Small sparks flashed across the metal. The Japanese pilot reacted instantly. The 0 snap rolled to the right and dove steeply. Normally, this was the moment when the P-38 would fall behind. Normally, the roll response would lag. But this time, something felt different. Hayes moved the stick, and the airplane responded instantly. No delay, no hesitation. The P-38 rolled faster than Hayes had ever felt before. The nose came down sharply. The 0 stayed inside his gun sight. Hayes fired again. A short burst. The rounds walked straight up 0's fuselage. From the tail into the cockpit, the Japanese fighter exploded into flames. Pieces of debris scattered across the sky as the aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the jungle below. Hayes stared at the falling wreckage in disbelief. His first kill, but the fight wasn't over. His wingman shouted over the radio. 3 0's diving from above. Hayes looked up. 3 Japanese fighters were descending rapidly. They had seen their comrade destroyed. Now they wanted... Hayes pushed the throttles forward and began to climb, but the 0's were diving faster. They would catch him within seconds. Under normal circumstances, the correct response would be to dive away, use the P-38's superior speed, but Hayes realized something important. This time his airplane could roll. This time it could fight. So he did something American pilots were told never to do. He turned hard. The P-38 snapped left with shocking speed. Lead 0 overshot slightly. The Japanese pilot clearly hadn't expected the American fighter to reverse so quickly. For a brief moment, the 0 was exposed. Hayes pulled lead and fired. The cannon shell struck the wing. The wing folded instantly. The aircraft disintegrated. 2 kills in less than 30 seconds. The remaining 2 0's tried to trap Hayes using a classic maneuver, scissors. Each aircraft alternating turns to force the American to overshoot. Normally this tactic worked perfectly against P-38s, but Hayes stayed inside their turns. Every time they reversed direction, his aircraft snapped around instantly. No delay, no sluggish controls, just pure response. One of the 0's reversed too sharply. Lost speed. For a moment, the fighter hung in the air. Hayes slid behind him at barely 200 feet. He fired a single burst. The 0 exploded. Debris slammed into Hayes' right boom. The P-38 shuddered violently but remained intact. 3 kills. The fourth Zero immediately turned and ran. Hayes watched him toward the clouds. He didn't pursue. His fuel was low, his ammunition almost gone. Instead, he climbed back to altitude. The entire fight had lasted less than 7 minutes, but it felt like hours. Returning to base at 9:03, Hayes landed back at Dobodura. The moment the engine shut down, he climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking, his uniform soaked with sweat. He walked directly toward McKenna. Ground crews were already swarming the aircraft, inspecting bullet holes and debris damage. But Hayes ignored them. He stopped in front of McKenna. For a few seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he said 2 words. It worked. McKenna nodded quietly, but someone else had been watching. From high altitude, another pilot had observed the entire fight, Captain Frank Mitchell. Mitchell was a veteran flight leader with the 475th Fighter Group. He had seen dozens of dogfights, and something about Hayes' aircraft had caught his attention immediately. The P-38 had rode faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. It snapped through turns like a completely different airplane. Mitchell knew Hayes was good, but not that good. After landing, Mitchell went straight to the debriefing room. Hayes was there filling out his combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell sat down across from him. "What's different about your airplane today?" Hayes shrugged. "It just responds faster." Mitchell leaned forward. "Maintenance do anything to it?" Hayes thought for a moment. Then he said, "Well, name McKenna." Captain Frank Mitchell didn't waste time. As soon as the debriefing ended, he walked straight across the airfield to the maintenance area. The afternoon sun was blazing over Dobodura airfield. Mechanics were working shirtless in the heat, covered in grease and sweat as they serviced aircraft returning from the morning missions. Mitchell found Technical Sergeant James McKenna leaning halfway inside the boom of another P-38, tightening a pulley bracket. "Sergeant McKenna," Mitchell called. McKenna slid out from under the aircraft and wiped his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir." Mitchell looked around to make sure no officers were nearby. Then he lowered his voice. "What did you change on Hayes' airplane?" McKenna studied him for a moment. Most officers wouldn't even ask that question. Most would simply assume the pilot had flown well and move on. But Mitchell wasn't most officers. He was a combat veteran. He had watched Hayes' fight from 15,000 feet and knew something mechanical had changed. McKenna finally answered quietly. "The aileron control cable tension, sir." Mitchell frowned. "What about it?" "There was slack in the system. Factory tolerance allows it." "Yes, sir, it does." Mitchell crossed his arms. "But you removed it." McKenna nodded slowly. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "How?" McKenna glanced around again. Then he walked Mitchell over to Hayes' aircraft. He removed the inspection panel inside the left boom. Mitchell leaned closer. McKenna pointed his flashlight inside. There, hidden within the pulley system, was a small Z-shaped piece of piano wire acting as a tensioner. Mitchell stared at it. "That's it? Yes, sir? That tiny piece of wire? Yes, sir?" Mitchell thought about what he had seen in the air that morning. The lightning-fast roll, the instant control response. 3 Japanese fighters destroyed in minutes. Then he looked back at McKenna. "Can you do it to my airplane?" McKenna hesitated. "Sir, unauthorized." Mitchell shrugged. "So is getting shot down." McKenna let out a quiet breath. "If the engineering officer finds out," Mitchell cut him off. "He won't." Then he added something that surprised McKenna. "I've lost 4 pilots in my flight this month. Every one of them caught in turning fights they couldn't escape." Mitchell tapped the piano wire tensioner with his finger. "If that little piece of wire gives my pilots even 1 extra second of response time, I want it installed." McKenna nodded. Tonight after lights out, the spread that evening, McKenna installed the same modification on Mitchell's P-38. 8 minutes, same piano wire, same C-shaped tensioner, same result. The next morning, Mitchell flew combat again. When he returned, he walked into the ready room grinning. "The airplane rolls like a fighter now," he told the other pilots. "Not like a heavy truck, like a fighter." The room went quiet. Pilots listened carefully when someone with 16 kills. Mitchell leaned closer to them. "Talk to your crew chiefs," that was all he said, but it was enough. Word spread through the squadron faster than any official memo ever could. Pilots started quietly asking their mechanics about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs refused immediately. They knew it violated regulations. Altering flight control systems without authorization could end a career. But others were willing to listen, and McKenna showed them how. 6 inches of piano wire bent into a Z-shape, installed as a tensioner in the aileron control cable. 8 minutes of work, 1 tiny change, mass difference. Within 3 days, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. Within a week, nearly half the squadron's P-38s had the modification. Pilots began returning from missions with stories. Stories about how the Lightning suddenly felt different, sharper, faster, more alive in the air. Lieutenant Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd. Captain Mitchell destroyed 3 aircraft on August 25th. Other pilots started scoring their first victories. Pilots who had flown dozens of missions without a single kill were suddenly winning dogfights. The change was undeniable, but officially nothing had changed. A secret network, the modification spread quietly. No paperwork, no reports, just mechanics talking to mechanics, pilot to pilot, whispers in the ready room asking McKenna about the cable trick. Soon the idea traveled beyond Dobodura airfield. At Guinea airfield, miles away, a crew chief named Lieutenant James Watkins heard about it from a transferred pilot. Watkins was skeptical at first, but curiosity when he tried the modification on 1 aircraft. The pilot flying that plane returned the next day with his first kill after 8 weeks of combat. Watkins immediately modified 4 more aircraft. Other mechanics in the 49th Fighter Group followed. By early September, nearly 40 P-38s across New Guinea were flying with McKenna's piano wire modification. The engineering officers noticed something odd during routine inspections. Cable tension readings sometimes looked inconsistent. But every time inspections happened, the mechanics quietly removed the tensioners beforehand, then reinstalled them afterward. The officers never found the modification. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, but the official report said nothing. The numbers changed. By late summer, the statistics started shifting. In July 1943, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific were losing 2 P-38s for every Japanese Zero destroyed. The Lightning was powerful but struggled in maneuvering fights. But in August, the ratio improved. 1.3 American aircraft lost for every Zero destroyed. By September, the numbers were almost even. Something had changed, but officially no one could explain why. The Japanese noticed Japanese fighter pilots were the first to recognize the difference. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet began mentioning strange encounters with American P-38s. Zeros were suddenly having trouble executing their traditional maneuvering tactics. The Americans were rolling faster, reversing direction quicker. It didn't make sense. One Japanese ace in particular noticed the change. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous fighter pilots, 64 confirmed kills. Sakai had fought Allied pilots since the attack on Pearl Harbor. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of every American fighter, especially the P-38. On September 3, 1943, Sakai encountered a P-38 over WWII. He used his favorite tactic. He baited the American into a turning fight. Waited for the moment when the P-38 began rolling into the turn. Then Sakai snapped his Zero in the opposite direction. Normally this maneuver worked perfectly. The Zero's superior agility allowed it to cut inside the American fighter's turn. But this time something unexpected happened. The P-38 reversed with him. Instantly, Sakai nearly collided head-on with the American aircraft. First time in his career he had to dive away to escape. When he landed back at base, he was furious. Something about the American fighter had changed, but he couldn't understand what. The airplane looked the same, the engine sounded the same, yet it reacted differently in the air. And that tiny difference was suddenly killing experienced Japanese pilots. For the Japanese pilots, the change was deeply confusing. For nearly 2 years, the Mitsubishi Zero had dominated turning fights in the Pacific. Japanese pilots were trained from the beginning to exploit that advantage. They knew that if they could force an American fighter into a horizontal turning battle, they would almost always win. That confidence had become instinct, but suddenly that instinct was failing. Pilots reported that American P-38 Lightnings were reversing direction faster than expected. The timing that Japanese pilots relied on during combat maneuvers was no longer reliable. The difference was small, just a fraction of a second. But in air combat, fractions of a second decide who lives and who dies. Japanese intelligence officers began examining wreckage from downed American aircraft. They looked for signs of new weapons, new engines, new control surfaces. They found nothing. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been fighting for months. Same engine, same armament, same airframe. Nothing obvious had changed. What they didn't know was that the real change was hidden deep inside the aircraft's boom structure, a simple 6-inch piece of piano wire. Even if they had discovered it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon, it wasn't a major redesign, it was just a small mechanical adjustment. But that tiny adjustment had altered the response of the aircraft enough to change the outcome of dogfights across New Guinea. By mid-September, the results were becoming clear. Japanese fighter losses were rising. American pilots flying modified P-38s were surviving encounters that would have been fatal just a few months earlier. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. For years, they had believed the Zero was unbeatable in maneuvering combat. Now that belief was beginning to crack. Some pilots became more cautious. Others became more aggressive, trying to close the distance faster before the Americans could react. But neither approach solved the real problem. They were fighting an enemy whose capabilities had quietly changed. Of September 1943, Japanese units operating in the region had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses during the same period were 22 aircraft. For the first time in that theater of the war, the Lightning was achieving a favorable exchange ratio against the Zero. Japanese command eventually issued new guidance to their pilots. Avoid engaging P-38s unless you have clear numerical superiority. That order marked a turning point. The Zero, once the hunter of the Pacific skies, had become cautious, sometimes even hunted. And all of it traced back to a modification that technically should never have existed. Discovery in October 1943, a routine maintenance inspection at Dobodura airfield finally uncovered the secret. An engineering officer noticed inconsistent cable tension readings during inspections of several P-38 aircraft. At first, he assumed it was simply maintenance variation, but the pattern kept appearing. Some aircraft felt slightly tighter in the controls, others did not. Curious, the officer ordered a deeper inspection. Eventually, one mechanic forgot to remove the tensioner before the inspection began. The officer discovered the small Z-shaped piece of piano wire inside the control system, an unauthorized modification. The discovery triggered immediate questions. Who had installed it? Why? And why were so many aircraft suddenly flying with it? The investigation quickly traced the origin back to Technical Sergeant James McKenna.
Report describing the modification was sent up the chain of command.
For several weeks, the document moved slowly between offices. Commanders faced a difficult decision. Technically, the mechanics involved had violated maintenance regulations. Unauthorized changes to flight control systems were serious offenses. In theory, they could be court-martialed, but there was a problem. The modification worked. Squadrons using the tensioner were achieving better combat results. Missions at higher rates. Punishing the mechanics who installed it might damage morale and remove a solution that was clearly helping American pilots in combat. Eventually, higher command decided on a practical approach. Instead of punishment, they requested an engineering evaluation. Lockheed investigation in November 1943, engineers from the aircraft manufacturer arrived in New Guinea. The aircraft in question was the famous Lockheed P-38 Lightning, one of the most advanced fighters in the Allied arsenal. The engineers carefully examined the field modification. They measured cable tensions, calculated stress loads on the control system, conducted flight tests. The results surprised them. The modification was not only safe, it significantly improved roll response at certain speeds. The slack in the original cable design had been considered acceptable during factory testing, but real combat conditions had revealed a weakness the engineers had not fully appreciated. Their conclusion was simple. The tensioning concept should have been included in the original design. Lockheed engineers soon incorporated a refined version of the tensioning system into later production models of the P-38, particularly the improved Lockheed P-38J Lightning. But in the official engineering documentation, the origin of the idea was described simply as field observations. McKenna's name never appeared. After the war, Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions and eventually scored 11 aerial victories. In 1945, he returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and started a family. For the next 37 years, he worked as a crop dusting pilot, but every year on August 17th, he made a phone call. He called James McKenna just to say thank you. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived. He eventually became a squadron commander and later continued his career in the United States Air Force. He retired as a colonel in 1963. Throughout his career, Mitchell told young officers the story of the piano wire tensioner. He used it as an example of an important lesson. Sometimes the people who understand a machine best are not the engineers who designed it, but the mechanics who work on it every day. James McKenna himself left the Army Air Forces in 1946. He returned to California and opened a small auto repair garage in Long Beach in 1948. For more than 40 years, he worked on engines, transmissions, and brakes. When people asked about the war, he usually answered with a simple sentence: "I was a mechanic, fixed airplanes." He never spoke much about the piano wire modification. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 combat records discovered references to the unusual tensioner modification in maintenance logs from New Guinea. Curious, the historian tracked down M.A. Kenna through veteran records. M.A. Kenna was 73 years old at the time, still working part-time in his garage. When asked about the modification, he shrugged. It wasn't anything special. He said just something that needed doing based on combat survival statistics from units that used the modification. Historians later estimated that the small change may have helped save between 80 and 100 American pilots during the war. James McKenna never kept count. For him, the only thing that mattered was the pilots who came back alive, and the many others who landed safely after missions that might otherwise have been their last. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. His obituary mentioned his service during the Second World War as an aircraft mechanic, but it did not mention the piano wire tensioner. It did not mention the dogfights it helped change, and it did not mention the lives it helped save. Sometimes the biggest changes in history come from the smallest ideas. A 6-inch piece of piano wire installed by a mechanic who refused to accept that regulations mattered more than lives. That is how innovation often works in wartime. Not through committees or long engineering reports, but through people on the front lines who see a problem and decide to fix it. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are thousands of forgotten stories from World War II still waiting to be told. Stories about the pilots, mechanics, soldiers, and engineers whose actions changed history in ways most people never hear about. If you enjoyed this one, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community includes viewers from all over the world, from veterans and historians to students and aviation enthusiasts. Every story matters, and everyone deserves to be remembered.